guess I'll go ahead and start, Diana, if you want to, if you want to just let me go. So Diana has been gracious enough to invite me to present at the Atlanta Global Studies Symposium. I am new to this area. Garrett Delavan is my name. I'm actually my first year as a GSU faculty member. I'm in the middle and secondary education department. I have 3 years under my belt as an academic out in California, so I'm kind of learning the new context here. And preparing this talk was a chance also to get to know local environmental struggles that are going on that I could sort of give as examples, right, and learn about myself. So I had a lot of fun actually preparing this talk and making it more localized. As well, I was able to look into the environmental literacy initiatives that are happening at the state level, look for schools that have a focus on environment in their sort of school focus, particularly charter schools often can do more of a focus than traditional schools, but I found several language programs that were sort of balancing the idea of multilingualism with environmentalism. So that's kind of what I've been hoping to discover and get involved in this context. And I'm also particularly interested, if you are willing to share your perspectives about whether you have already started teaching around environmental topics in your world language classrooms. Caroline, who came on early, was already telling us a little bit about how she teaches Portuguese at Georgia Tech and has already started talking about sustainability issues, environmental issues as a topic for generating dialogue, language, and interest and engagement, right? So to just briefly summarize the work, I am recommending a way of engaging students through seeing yourself as part of an environmental literacy movement to teach environmental literacy in all content areas and to have that as sort of a springboard also to student engagement through identity, right? In my experience, and many people say this, although some people don't see the world this way, environmentalism historically has been associated with white middle-class folks who have time on their hands to worry about particularly wilderness protection, right? And so many people trace the environmental movement to the 1890s or 80s, I think, in California, when one of the valleys right next to Yosemite Valley, which is of course protected, was pretty much sacrificed for a dam to give water to San Francisco, right? And there was so much outcry from the activists, particularly John Muir, the most famous one, that it really started the first real movement to do something about the environment in the United States, if you don't count, all of the indigenous cultures who already have a sense of how to protect the environment, right? So it's one of those same processes where if you're just looking at European Americans, that's the beginning of the movement, right? And so this obsession with wilderness has been a huge sort of burden for the movement because a lot of people don't identify with protecting wilderness. They're more concerned with stuff that's closer to their backyard and affecting their communities, closer to health issues and toxic pollution than to open space, right? So my goal is to make sure that language teachers see it as an opportunity to find a diversity of identities working on environmental issues, and particularly to focus on activism rather than to focus on the problem, because we want to empower students to feel that it's worth getting involved as opposed to sort of depress them with the unsolvable, overwhelming weight of it all, right? And the focus on activism also is about showing them that engagement is possible and that by bringing in a diversity of communities, ethnic racial identities and spaces around the globe, not just here in the US. You're also showing them that, you know, anyone can identify with an environmental issue they'd like to do something about. And anyone can identify with people who have taken action, right? So I don't want to say a ton. That those of you, I hope, you know, had a chance to watch my talk. I'd like to hear, you know, your questions or anecdotes of what you got out of the presentation. Well, I'll say one last thing just for folks to refresh your memory. I am recommending a very simple approach to getting started if you haven't yet gotten started, or if you want to expand what you currently teach around environmental issues. And that's this idea of movie talk. I'd be happy also to hear stories of whether you've used movie talk or similar approaches for other topics and other types of teaching. But I found it when I was a Spanish teacher in middle school for 8 years to be one of the most engaging and powerful tools for driving discussion. And essentially my approach is to movie talk is to interpret it as it's all about the pauses. You've got to pause frequently to generate dialogue. People do it in different ways, and some people do a lot sort of less pausing, and then they come back and they have still shots, screenshots of parts of the movie right after the whole class has gotten the whole narrative of the movie. In my experience, there's so much to be gained from the suspense of not knowing what's next, and to generating conversations about, well, what do you think is happening? What do you think is going to happen, right? And so you've got an entire sort of treasure trove of dialogue opportunity around students working theories of where the movie is going, but also you've got all the details in the moment of any particular scene that by the end of the movie, no one's going to remember this detail, but think how much language we could reinforce by discussing this particular detail, you know? So it's like you're juggling the goal of, I want them to get the big idea. I want them to be able to talk about the main message of this movie. But at the same time, if there's an opportunity just to pick out, well, wait, remember when we were doing, you know, clothing? What kind of clothing is this again? You know, I mean, just sort of a chance to go into review mode or reinforcement mode, or go off on an interesting tangent that brings that joy of impromptu dialogue and kind of that real communicative teaching feel that we all strive to have in our, I hope, strive to have for our students' benefit, to keep them engaged and awake and passionate about what might happen the next day, as opposed to, yes, it's all planned in advance, right? So that's the idea, right? Is to center the curriculum around movies that you find that drive the discussion, and then you create dialogue structured to the linguistic goals that you have for that particular group of students. And one last thing I'll add before I open it up to you. You can show movies in English, right? To create that translanguaging opportunity. Actful, of course, at a certain point in the 90s, I think, decided, you know, to make sure that we're at least working on the goal of 90% target language, but they never endorsed 100%, right? And there's this kind of puritanism in some circles and historically of trying to gain new languages without recourse to our current languages. And that's just all but dead in the minds of most researchers, right? Because we've always already used what we do know about language to make guesses about how to make ourselves understood in the new language, right? And so we might as well embrace it, right? And so the idea is have them understand the content clearly through a movie that might actually be in the first language of most of the students, or hopefully all, if you are lucky enough. But then immediately begin to discuss it in the target language and scaffold that experience with target language resources or translated resources. So that's all I want to say, so that there's enough time for people to bring up questions about either the method I'm recommending or the topics that you found interesting environmentally that you might want to try, or that you already have done in your classroom, or experiences with movie talk or similar methods. I'd love to hear what you thought.
Hi, I'm not a teacher, but I'm a student. I was kind of curious about the topic, but I was wondering how the language that is being taught would affect this method. Like, for example, someone learning German might have an easier time integrating these topics into the classroom, because German culture kind of strives to be more sustainable than other cultures, so that might be a plus. And also, like, scientific vocab in some languages might be easier for beginners to learn versus other languages. So I'm curious, like, how that affects the method.
I think you're right that there is going to be certain advantages and disadvantages with scientific topics, particularly in terms of cognates, right? All those languages that have agreed to the convention of using Latin to speak about science, you know, can make a lot of progress in transferring cross-linguistically that scientific knowledge pretty quickly, right? And making pretty educated guesses as to what the translation of a scientific concept might be. I don't think the cultural aspect is as big as a hurdle as you might think, though, because I think the way we think of Germany as a super environmental place, I mean, they have a green party that wins elections. I mean, that's certainly a huge difference. But every space has some kind of environmental activism happening, in my experience, unless it's like a complete dictatorship, you know, where there really just isn't the ability to speak out. And more often than not, you know, your surest bet is to go to the indigenous peoples in a space and kind of see what they're doing about the land that they've lost and the way that the land that they were on is being treated currently by the dominant settler group or groups, right? And that's the world over. You know, we have those groups. Even Europe has its last indigenous group, the Sami, up in Finland in the north. So that's where I would say, you know, keep your eyes open. You're preparing to be a German teacher, or which language, Hannah?
Oh, I'm not preparing to be a teacher. I just was interested in language learning, and so I wanted to know about the topic.
Yeah, I think it's an invitation for all teachers, once they've chosen the language they want to teach, to discover what's there. And in some cultures, we don't think it's as obvious or easy to find, but it is there, right? I mean, Latin America happens to be rife with assassinations of indigenous leaders, and mostly we hear about what's happening there because we hear that another one of them has been killed, unfortunately. And it just, the awareness that we get in the United States of what's going on in the rest of the world is already so limited. Sometimes it's these tragedies, they're the only things that make the news, that we get this on our radar screen, right? Who else would be willing to step in and say something about your own teaching, or if you're not even in the teaching path, curiosities you have about the method or the environmental activism topics?
Dr. Delavan, I'd like to ask a question, if you don't mind. My background is in teaching English as a second language, so it's a little bit different than teaching, you know, foreign languages and world languages. But I wondered what the reception has been by students who are learning about sustainability and climate action, and I assume, but maybe wrongly, that most of your students are concerned about the environment. How much of your class time do you spend just kind of laying the foundation and talking about the issues compared to language learning?
Well, the idea is to, at least with the movie talk as an approach, is part of a larger umbrella of comprehensible input-based approaches, is how most practitioners in world language ed see it. And this school of thought is definitely less rigorous about the teaching of grammar and the teaching and the requiring of correct utterances from the beginning, right? And so generally the approach is that you pick a finite list of language skills to focus on in one session, however your sort of design interface with students is. So for example, in one movie talk of a 20-minute movie, you would pick, say, 5 things to focus on linguistically, and they would be very clearly displayed for the students. And in a world language context, usually you can rely on people knowing a common first language, and you clearly translate them. So you would start by just making the language goals very clear, and then you would jump into making the topic very clear. So that could either be by delivering the movie in English and then talking about it in Spanish, or by kind of a first language discussion of the topic to get the mind into the frame of hearing a Spanish movie, for example, in a Spanish class. But once you've sort of set the linguistic focus, which you'll refer back to, and that's pretty much the only form of the language that you'll worry about correcting or having students notice the formal changes to word endings, etc., or word order that make a difference. And the rest will be communicative in its goal, just getting as much language happening as possible and getting as much feedback as possible on how much comprehension is happening. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is circling, which I explain in the talk, which is simply taking one fact for a discussion, one fact at a time, and asking as many questions about that fact as possible. So if it's, you've paused the movie and there's a guy doing something, you ask, what is he doing? And the whole class chorally knows they're supposed to chorally respond. And if only 2 people respond, then you're like, aha, isn't he blah, blah, blahing? And you provide the language they need, and then you re-ask it and you reframe it into, so he's blah, blah, blahing? Yes. How long has he been blah, blah, blahing? I don't know, however you keep doing the blah, blah, blah phrase or chunk of language that you want to keep reinforcing, if you keep putting it into newly formed and novel questions that everyone answers, you constantly know exactly how comprehensible your language is, and you get repetitions without boredom, right? And it depends on the level of your students, but you can do this at any level, right? And the higher the proficiency level, the less repetition is needed to connect new knowledge to the language system in our heads, right? We learn faster as we get more to connect it to, and so you just ask a few questions. It's more like a language, more like a discussion of a video in one's first language. The more low proficiency that you're actually targeting in terms of the comprehensibility, the more repetition you generate, right? And so that's where it's a balance where you have to go at the speed and the repetitiveness that's going to make it work for the language level you're targeting. So a 20-minute video could take 3 days in a novice class, right? Because you'll be milking every detail. You might watch it again and just give people a second chance to really like, oh yeah, I know how to answer these questions because we know this, and just building confidence, etc. And so I think in this approach of comprehensible input as the foundational goal, there's not going to be a kind of learn the language, now switch to the content, now learn the language. There's just going to be a quick explanation of the language. It's always there to the formal, study of the language, always there to refer to. And when there's a grammar point, the idea usually in this group of practitioners is do a pop-up like you would have on the screen and then make it go away and get back to the topic, right? So, okay, does anybody remember why that vowel changed in that word? No, that's called a subjunctive. Let's remember it's this and this and this. Yeah, anyway, that's what it's called. Let's move on and not get mired in the abstraction of the grammar, but to notice, linger for a sec, and just through repetition, by the 20th time, oh yeah, subjunctive. Yeah, when things aren't quite as real as, yeah, boom, you got it, That's the essence of the approach. Does that answer your question, Diane?
Yes, it does. Great techniques. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments, connections to your own teaching? Well, since we're such a small group, why don't we just get comfortable and each of us sort of say where we're coming from. Caroline teaches Portuguese at Georgia Tech. Viviane, do you mind being first since you're the one with the camera on? You're obviously a little more out there.
I apologize. I was teaching a class, so I got here a few minutes ago. So I couldn't contribute with a question, but I'll be happy to join the conversation. So I teach Portuguese as well, but at the University of Georgia. And yeah, I work with the Portuguese flagship program with students in all levels of Portuguese.
Great. Eric, do you mind letting us know how you're involved in World Language Ed, if so? Okay. So Liz says she's a student in Global Media and Cultures. Excellent.
Nice.
Liz, are you planning to move into teaching the language or another type of career?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I still have a bit of time before I graduate, but I am interested in potentially teaching one day. I think I'm also just more so interested in how like people learn languages.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
So like, and also how do you teach someone who maybe doesn't speak the same language as you?
Well, the short answer is comprehensible input-based approaches because they are fun, dialogic, without that heavy, you're doing school right now, and don't forget it, right? It's more of a, what? Oh yeah, this is school. I forgot because I was having fun and I got interested in the topic. Good. Okay, Mary, do you want to share where you're coming to this conversation from? Well, while we wait, if maybe she's away from her screen, Viviane, do you want to talk a little bit about your practice? Have you used environmental topics? Have you used Movie Talk? Either of those sort of reflect some of what you do, and what's it like for you?
So I took a class at UJ a while ago that talked about Tprs, so teaching language through storytelling, something like that. So the idea that you pose a question and you create a story, and it's all about comprehensive input and no translation. So the speaking the most you can in the language with images and connections and examples of with using the students as characters, for example, or catchy things like food. And I really enjoyed that. And I teach mostly first year students, and a lot of them, they have a background in Spanish from high school, but they feel they do not know anything. And they always say, oh, I didn't learn Spanish in high school. And so I try to show them that they can speak Portuguese if they took 3 semesters, 3 years of Spanish. Even if they took 1 year of Spanish in high school, they can do so much in Portuguese already. So I try to use that. So I ask a lot of questions and ask them to make a lot of descriptions. And I agree with you, comprehensive input. So cognates, easy verbs, easy to conjugate verbs. So that's what I start with.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you've hit on the problematic, right? Why do so many people emerge from high school experiences saying, I can't do anything? I sat there, right? It was a Spanish class, but yeah, I have nothing to show.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the problematic that this comprehensible input movement is trying to address, right? Like, well, what could change that? De-emphasize the form, prioritize the meaning, the communication, the fluidity of what people can do with a very small, less ambitious list of vocabulary and structures, right? Teach the most commonly used words that can be recombined in many different ways to say many different things through circumlocution, as opposed to using the precise word that the native speaker might use, right? And that's pretty much the essence of the sort of the linguistic goals of most of folks that use this, is to say, look, give me the list of the 1,000 most used words in this language. I'll pick this for year 1, I'll pick these for year 2. And yeah, when the subjunctive comes up, I'll point it out, but I'm going to spend 35 seconds on it, 30 times, and then they're basically get it, but they're not going to produce it right away because it's a complex structure that doesn't get produced by anybody right away. And some native speaking communities don't use it because it's so rare that it's like, forget it. I don't want to teach my kids that. It's ridiculous. Yasu, do you mind telling us a little bit about where you were coming from for the conversation, and had you watched the video?
I'm sorry, I'm not Yasu, but using my friend's computer.
Oh, okay.
But I thought this section is start at 6:30, so I just get in. I didn't quote what you are discussing about.
Okay, sorry, I did not realize that we were going to come in on the same call. Okay, no problem. So I'm going to put my email in here, and I will be happy to discuss more, answer more questions. Whoops, let me make sure it goes to everybody. And I appreciate you guys attending and letting me know kind of what your questions are about this. I'd be happy to hear more. And Diane, I'm welcome to stay for the next chat, right?
Yes, of course. Please do. Please do. And yes, thank you to everyone for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Garrett Delavan, Associate Professor at the Georgia State University Department of Middle and Secondary Education. And we're going to transition now over to our second presenter today, Viviane Klen-Alves, who will be talking to us about Teletandem.
Hi, everybody. It is great to be able to speak after a colleague that is so close to me here at Georgia State. And it's also interesting that I'm in TESOL and World Language Education, so language and literacy. And I decided to do my PhD in language and literacy in the College of Education because I felt they need to go to the classroom to do research, applied research in the classroom. Although here in the US, the Portuguese programs, they're usually connected with the Romance languages department, so literature and culture. I wanted to be working with the teachers and the students, so I'm transitioning in between, and I really enjoy that interdisciplinarity of these fields. So I hope you have seen the video. I'll just put my slides up really quickly in case you have specific questions about Teletandem or virtual exchange in general. And we can talk about ways you can implement it in your own context, or if you have questions specifically about the ways that I have been implementing it here at UGA, we can talk about that. So it's a very free 30 minutes for us to learn from one another. Okay. Just a second, for some reason, my screen is not showing. So many things opened. Okay, just share screen, and then I'll go to the PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I talked a little bit about what Teletandem is. And I think one of the things that people ask me the most is how it can be integrated to the language classroom. So I'm going to leave on this slide, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have. If not, I can talk about Teletandem in general. So just let me know, give you a few minutes. I'll speak. If questions emerge as I speak, you are welcome to paste them on the chat or stop me to ask the questions, okay? So basically, I have been working with Teletandem, a specific type of tele-collaboration from Brazil, since 2012, my first year here at the University of Georgia. And Teletandem is basically a tele-collaboration program. So we have a division in the field of virtual exchange on two types of programs. So eTandem, which came from the tandem that everybody did in the past of getting our students to speak with other people in the language that they were learning. And then it evolved from in person in a coffee shop to virtual with the emergence of the internet. And then people started exchanging emails first and then chats. And we know the technology is evolving really quickly. So right now we are using Zoom and we are communicating synchronously through video chat, but we do not know where we are going next, right? Some programs are talking about virtual reality, for example, to teach languages. So you can go to São Paulo, Brazil, where I'm from, and walk around from your house. But tele-collaboration and Teletandem is a partnership that is based in three principles. So autonomy, the students decide what they are going to be talking about during the interactions. Reciprocity, so it's a two-way street. Students at the same time that they are helping the other, they are benefiting from that person's help and support. And then Teletandem had a pillar called separation of languages, which I'm trying to expand in definition in my dissertation, because what it means when they say separation of languages is that half of the time is one language, half of the time it's in the other language. But if you are all in the classroom, you know that this is not a reality that we should be comfortable with, because I believe as a professor, as an educator, that students are multilingual, or they're working towards becoming multilingual. And then it's okay if they need the support of one of the languages that they know to speak the other language. So when we discuss separation of languages, if we think of a purpose, so for example, for 30 minutes, I'm trying to use the language that I'm learning. So I'm trying to use Portuguese to communicate. But it's okay if I use my background in Spanish. It's okay if I speak and then I ask how to say something in another language that I know. You're using the languages as tools, as resources to help you get your meaning. So when we think about this principle of separation of languages, I would like to think about another name that doesn't mean separating, because I do not believe we can simply separate. It's like separating our identity from language. And another important thing about Teletandem in the reciprocity is that it's free. So nowadays there are several programs and there are hundreds. For example, I saw that Talk Abroad program that is paid is used by more than 100 universities already. And I feel sad because I feel it's important that we use the opportunity of virtual exchange to reach out to different communities globally. So of course, here in the US, we have the resources to pay, for example, for the textbook. For my courses, the textbook is $100. And students can afford that textbook. But if we can provide resources that are free, or resources that give students this opportunity of giving back, so that the reciprocity of Teletandem, that they are learning Portuguese and they are using that language, but they are helping their peers in Brazil, for example, to speak English and learn that language. So I like that concept a lot. And then when we talk about using tele-collaboration or using virtual exchange, I think the biggest challenge in our field is how to best integrate it to the classroom. So we are still learning at UJ, even though we have been doing that since 2011, and I have been doing it since 2012. This is an image of how we integrate it. So we have a preparation phase, then we do task-based activities, and then reflection pieces. And we use the feedback from the students to improve for the next academic year. So this is an example from a class that I taught. an intermediate level of Portuguese. The literature recommends that we do at least 7 sessions of exchange. Some programs will only work with 1 interaction in a semester or 3 interactions. They can work with interactions in which English is the only language, lingua franca, or they can work like we do at UJ, uh, uh, where we focus on language learning, language teaching and learning. So it is half the time in one language and half the time in the other language. And then there are several gangs reported in the literature. The literature also reports on all the problems that you can encounter. I do not know if any of you have tried in the past to integrate any type of technology in the classroom. You know that sometimes when you are trying to use Kahoot, maybe the students do not have their cell phones with them. So there are many roadblocks that you can face, but it's very rewarding. And once you have used the technology more often, you get used and you learn a lot about the roadblocks. So for example, one of our biggest challenges was the noise. And if students are afraid of speaking in the language, we just talked about high school students who say they are not ready, they do not know anything about the language, and then they go to college and we say, hey, you're going to speak with a native speaker of the language. They are going to be like, what? And they don't want their peers to hear them as well. So you need to prepare the students and prepare the environment so that they feel comfortable doing that. And to do that, we have a lab space designed for that. We have space between the students. Each student has their own desktop with a headset. We have the same space in Brazil as well. Unesp, the university that owns Teletandem, that designs Teletandem, got a lab space through a grant. And then we help students, we support them. So for example, guiding them through how to ask questions in Portuguese before they participate, or giving them a topic that they can talk about during the interactions. So anyways, here in this slide, you can see some of the gains that I noticed in our students in the intermediate level. And we can notice if you use ACTFL standards, you can notice these gains as well, just by working with the communicative approach, with input that is meaningful, like the last presentation was sharing comprehensive input. And then what I feel is different about Teletandem is that I speak less, my students speak more. So even when I'm working with comprehensive input, I have 28 students in a Portuguese 1001 level. And then I have 15 students in a 2000 level. In Teletandem, each of them are speaking with their own peer. So they have more time using the language. And you can notice increased gains in interpersonal communication. So the communication between two people, chatting about their day, their weekend, talking about their families, their hobbies. We also keep the same peer every week. And that's, I think, a difference between the paid programs. In the paid programs, you go with the availability of the teachers that they hire to work with them. But with Teletandem, the student has one peer from the first class to the final class. Unless, for example, the students report that they didn't get along with their peer, then we can match them with another person. But these reports really important because then they say they become friends with somebody in the language. And it's also interesting that most of them say it's the first time they're speaking with somebody from that culture and that language. And as a Brazilian, I remember learning English with Brazilians, both in high school, then in English courses, and then in college. And here it's different for my students because a lot of the people teaching Portuguese here are Brazilians. So they have a native speaker who they can talk to. But they know that I also speak English. And when they meet with their peers, they do not know if they speak English, how well they speak English. So it's a friend that they make in that other culture. So they also learn how to start a conversation in the other language, how to end a conversation, and that's in the intermediate mid level. They also learn how to write organized paragraphs. And this thing of the presentation writing is also important with the integration of Teletandem because they are not writing only for me, they are writing for somebody else. And they know that other people are going to read and provide feedback to their text. And that's also helpful for me as their teacher, because when I get the text, I get a second draft. So it's a much improved version of their first text. We also provide them with tips on how they should provide each other with feedback. So it's not revising everything and giving it to them, but discussing the mistakes and helping them learn. They also perform features of intermediate high and advanced low levels. So for example, asking and providing information using different time frames. The interactions are usually on Monday. So they have to talk about what they did on Sunday, what they did in the weekend, and what their plans for the week are. And they also improve on their interpretive listening and in understanding the main idea of the conversations. We are not naive as teachers, as educators. We know how long it takes for you to become proficient in a language and what are the steps like. So we know that in the intermediate level, sometimes they'll not be able to understand everything that the peer is saying, but it's okay. I think the experience is important, and then they can negotiate meaning, and they do it in beautiful ways. I have data example of students who Google things, who show images, who make signs with their hands, and students who use the other languages that they know, so translanguaging a lot as well. Then I brought some examples of what they do in here, but I think I'll just show you the references, some references if you're interested in implementing Teletandem yourself. So Aranha and Wigham, they just published a piece on virtual exchange, and they detail how Teletandem works. And then you also have Aranha and Cavallari talking about the different types of Teletandem, because if you're not teaching a class, you can also do it as a side project. For example, instead of a Portuguese table, which we have here weekly, you can do buddies, so Teletandem buddies, and then students speak outside of the classroom. And I also wrote a piece about working with K-12 students and technical college students on virtual exchange. And there are also other references like Haskell et al. That talk about the linguistic gangs and also about the problems when students are not reciprocal. They do not have a reciprocal relationship. As you can imagine, for example, if a peer is speaking much more and is asking more questions and not letting their peer to elaborate. So we always also work in mediation sessions in which we talk to the students about their experience and just working in general on improving these principles. And then there are also some references here on virtual exchange. If you're interested, some recent work on the impact of virtual exchange. And then also, although has written several pieces on virtual exchange currently. So I'm going to stop sharing screen and we have some minutes. So I saw we have a question here from Mari. Okay, how do you form the connections with other schools to find partners for exchange? Okay, first grade teacher, great. So I do have some contacts for you in Brazil if you want of teachers interested. Usually, unfortunately, we do this with college students and high school students because of image and the rules of the US schools usually. But there are a lot of bilingual and dual language immersion schools in Brazil, in São Paulo, that would be interested in exchanges, more like cultural exchanges. So for example, one day a conversation between the kids and the teacher, mediated by the teachers. I teach Portuguese, so I'm speaking from my experience in Portuguese. Mari, what language do you teach? Yeah, that would be important to know if it's Spanish and Portuguese. I sure can connect you with some people, and German as well.
Hi, Viviane. Thank you for your talk and explanation. And yeah, I would love to have some contacts in Brazil. I don't use with my Portuguese students, but I do use Lingua Meeting with Spanish. I teach Spanish as well. And I really liked what you said about the aspect of being free. And that is something more democratic in terms of like people having access to it. Yeah. Even though actually Lingua Meeting or Talk Abroad, they are not that costly, fortunately, and they're more guided also because you can guide them better. But having connections with the people directly, I think that's very enriching culturally. And yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, we should keep in touch, and I'm
definitely
happy you're using tele-collaboration. That's great.
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, I would love to keep in touch with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I just wanted to put that out as a resource for all of you teachers out there. If you are interested in virtual exchange, that we can help you find a partner in one of Atlanta's sister cities. If you are teaching one of those languages, that's why I asked Mary what language she teaches. But yeah, but feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Yeah, that's an excellent resource. Thank you, Gianna. Caroline, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So why you are not using it with Portuguese yet?
Well, we have started recently with the program at Georgia Tech. I mean, since fall of 19, so it's been kind of recent. Yeah. I have small groups as of now, like very small groups. So we have a very, low-key interactive class because I have, we're talking all the time, because it's like, I have 5-6 students, sometimes 10, but so it's possible to have a more interaction. And you talked about having the background in Spanish. Most of my students also, they're either native speakers of Spanish or they know how to speak Spanish. So that makes a difference. Yeah, but that's something that I would definitely consider for the future to add to my course.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We have 1 more minute. I'll also put my contact information here in case you would like to stay in touch. And Mary responded that she works with refugee students, so working with speakers of English. Yeah, maybe other first grade teachers would do that exchange. I think sometimes we tried to implement a junior Teletandem here in Georgia, but some teachers, they have so much on their plate, and the thought of scheduling sessions was really an additional burden for some of them. So we had to postpone that project, but maybe in the future, more teachers will be interested, because for me, these little kids, they are so interconnected already. They use technology so much better than us, right?
Well, it is 7 o'clock, and I want to thank both of our speakers today, Viviane Klen-Alves and Garrett Delavan, for being with us here this evening and answering our questions. I believe both presenters have put their email addresses in the chat. So if you want to go back and watch the presentation or contact them with any other questions, I'm sure they would be happy to answer your questions and give you support and advice as you continue teaching your languages. So thank you again for being here, and we appreciate your participation and hope to see you at another event real soon.